Imagine walking through a quiet hillside just outside Rio de Janeiro. You notice two men lying perfectly still on the ground. There are no signs of a struggle. Nothing appears to have been stolen. But then, you see what covers their faces. Homemade masks, cut from solid sheets of lead. Next to the bodies lies a handwritten note with mysterious instructions. Almost 60 years later, investigators still can't explain why these two men came here, what they were expecting, or what actually killed them. This is the lead masks case, one of the most baffling unsolved mysteries in modern history. On the morning of August 17, 1966, two men boarded a bus in the Brazilian city of Campos dos Goitacazes. Their trip seemed completely ordinary. They told their families they were traveling to Niterói to purchase electronic equipment for work. Neither of them gave any reason for concern, and no one imagined that this routine business trip would become one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in Brazilian history. The men were Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana. They worked as electronics technicians, repairing radios and building communication equipment. Friends described them as intelligent, practical, and deeply interested in technology. They were not known as criminals, nor did they have a history of violence. In many ways, they appeared to be two ordinary working men with a shared passion for electronics. Their destination, however, was more than 200 kilometers away. After arriving in Niterói, witnesses later remembered seeing the pair make two unusual purchases. First, they bought lightweight, waterproof raincoats, despite the warm weather. Then they stopped at a nearby shop and purchased a bottle of mineral water. At the time, these details meant nothing. Only later would investigators realize that they were among the final confirmed moments of the men's lives. From there, Manuel and Miguel headed toward Morro do Vintém, a quiet hill overlooking the city. No one knows exactly why they chose that location. There was no scheduled meeting, no official event, and no obvious reason for two electronics technicians to climb an isolated hillside carrying raincoats and a bottle of water. 3 days later, a local boy flying a kite noticed something unusual near the top of the hill. What he had found would confuse police, journalists, and investigators for decades to come. The two men were lying side by side. They were fully dressed in business suits. Their raincoats covered their clothes, and resting over their eyes were crude masks made from thick sheets of lead. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of robbery, no weapons, no indication that anyone had tried to hide the bodies. Instead, the scene looked strangely deliberate, as if the two men had calmly prepared for something they believed was about to happen. Beside them, investigators discovered an empty bottle of mineral water, two neatly folded towels, and a handwritten note. The message contained a sequence of short instructions, including a specific time, a reference to swallowing capsules, protecting metal objects, and waiting for a signal while wearing the lead masks. That note would become one of the most mysterious pieces of evidence ever recovered in a Brazilian criminal investigation. Because while almost every object at the scene raised questions, the note suggested that whatever happened on that hillside may not have been an accident at all. On the afternoon of August 20th, 1966, what appeared to be an ordinary walk through the hills overlooking Niterói turned into the beginning of one of Brazil's most perplexing criminal investigations. The first witness was not a police officer, a detective, or a journalist. It was a local teenage boy who had climbed Morro do Vintém, a wooded hill familiar to residents but rarely visited by outsiders. Children often explored its trails, searching for birds' nests, collecting abandoned kites caught in the trees. or simply enjoying the view over Guanabara Bay. Nothing suggested that this particular afternoon would be remembered for decades. As he moved through the undergrowth, the boy noticed two figures lying several meters ahead on the hillside. At first glance, there was nothing alarming about them. They were dressed in dark business suits, as though they had just left an office rather than climbed a steep, uneven slope. From a distance, they could easily have been mistaken for two men resting after a difficult walk. Only when he approached did the scene become unsettling. Neither man reacted to his presence. Neither appeared to be breathing. Their bodies were positioned neatly beside one another, with no obvious signs of panic or struggle. There were no overturned rocks, broken branches, or disturbed vegetation suggesting violence had taken place. Then he noticed the masks. Each man wore a crudely cut piece of lead over his eyes. They were not helmets or protective face shields. The metal covered only the eye sockets, leaving the nose, mouth, and the rest of the face completely exposed. Whatever purpose they had served, it was unlike any safety equipment investigators had ever encountered. Frightened, the boy ran back down the hill and alerted nearby adults. Within a short time, local police officers and firefighters began making their way to the location. What they found immediately challenged almost every expectation of a conventional crime scene. The victims were carrying money that had not been taken. Expensive wristwatches remained on their arms. Their clothing was clean and surprisingly orderly, despite the rough terrain. There were no visible injuries, no bloodstains, and no evidence that either man had attempted to defend himself. The hillside offered almost no clues. Near the bodies, investigators recovered only a few seemingly ordinary objects: an empty bottle of mineral water, a small towel, and a handwritten note folded inside a notebook. That note would become the most famous piece of evidence in the entire case. It contained no names, no dates, and no explanation, only a sequence of instructions. 4:30, be at the agreed location. 6:30, ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals. Wait for the signal. Even today, investigators cannot say with certainty who wrote those words. The note raised far more questions than it answered. What capsules were they expected to take? What signal were they waiting for? And perhaps most importantly, why had two electronics technicians climbed an isolated hillside wearing homemade lead masks that offered almost no practical protection? As forensic specialists began documenting the scene, they hoped the medical examination would provide the missing answers. Instead, the evidence only deepened the mystery. No obvious cause of death could be established at the scene. There were no external injuries capable of explaining what had happened, and the circumstances surrounding the bodies appeared so carefully arranged that some investigators wondered whether they were looking at an accident, a suicide pact, or something far more complex. Within hours, what had started as a routine response to the discovery of two bodies became a national investigation. Before long, newspapers across Brazil were calling it a mystery, unlike anything the country had ever seen. When detectives arrived at Morro do Vintém, they expected to find evidence that would explain what had happened during the previous evening. Instead, the scene became even more confusing with every passing minute. There were no signs of a struggle, no damaged vegetation, and nothing to suggest that the two men had tried to escape or defend themselves. The hillside was quiet, undisturbed, almost peaceful, as though nothing unusual had happened there at all. The victims were still wearing neatly pressed suits beneath expensive raincoats, despite the mild August weather. Their watches remained on their wrists, their wallets still contained cash, and every personal belonging appeared to be exactly where it should have been. For experienced investigators, This immediately ruled out one of the most obvious possibilities. If someone had intended to rob them, nothing had actually been taken, but that only made the mystery deeper. The most unusual objects at the scene were the lead masks resting over the men's eyes. They had been carefully cut by hand from thin sheets of lead, yet they looked unlike any protective equipment known to police or forensic specialists. They had no lenses, no straps to hold them in place, and no openings that would allow the wearer to see. Whatever their purpose had been, it was unlike anything investigators had encountered before. Then the investigation took an even stranger turn. While searching the victim's clothing, detectives discovered a small folded note inside one of the pockets. It wasn't a personal letter or a diary entry. It was simply a list of instructions written in calm, deliberate handwriting, as though someone expected every step to be followed precisely. 4:30 p.m. Be at the agreed location. 6:30 p.m. Take the capsules. After the effect, protect metals. Wait for the signal. The note contained no names, no signature, and no explanation of what any of those instructions actually meant. Investigators had no idea what the capsules were, what protect metals referred to, or what kind of signal the two men had apparently been waiting for on that isolated hill overlooking the city. Over the following hours, detectives searched the entire area again and again. They expected to find scientific equipment, radio devices, medicine containers, or at least some object that could connect the handwritten instructions to their deaths. Instead, they found almost nothing. No transmitter, no instruments, no evidence of an experiment. Only two experienced electronics technicians, two homemade lead masks, and a cryptic note that seemed to answer nothing while raising dozens of new questions. By the end of the first day, one thing had become painfully clear. This was no longer a routine investigation into two unexplained deaths. It was the beginning of a mystery that, nearly 60 years later, still refuses to give up its secrets. For investigators, the next logical step was to answer a simple question. What had Miguel Viana and Manuel Cruz done before they climbed Morro do Vintém? Unlike many unsolved mysteries, this one did not begin with complete silence. The two men had been seen by several ordinary people throughout the day. None of those witnesses realized they were observing what would become the final confirmed hours of their lives. On the morning of August 17th, 1966, Miguel and Manuel left their hometown of Campos dos Goitacazes and boarded a bus bound for Niterói. Friends and family later told police that the trip was supposed to be related to electronics. Nothing about their departure appeared unusual. They carried enough money for the journey and spoke as though they expected to return home the same evening. Hours later, after arriving in Niterói, the men stopped at a local clothing store. The purchase they made would later become one of the most recognizable details of the entire case. They bought two waterproof raincoats. To investigators, the decision seemed strange from the very beginning. It was August, the Brazilian winter, but the weather that afternoon was mild. There were no reports of heavy rain, and neither man had packed luggage, suggesting they planned to stay overnight. The shop assistant would later remember them clearly. According to her testimony, both men behaved politely, paid in cash, and appeared perfectly calm. Nothing in their behavior suggested fear, urgency, or confusion. If they were about to participate in something dangerous, they gave no outward sign of it. Shortly afterward, another witness encountered them. A waitress at a nearby bar recalled that one of the men purchased a bottle of mineral water before leaving toward the hills overlooking the city. At first, that detail seemed insignificant. But as investigators reconstructed the timeline, the bottle of water became surprisingly important. The mysterious handwritten note discovered later at the crime scene instructed the men to take the capsules. No capsules were ever found. Some investigators wondered whether the missing water had been intended to swallow whatever those capsules contained. Others argued there was no evidence connecting the two. Even today, no one can say for certain. As afternoon turned to evening, Miguel and Manuel began walking toward Morro do Vintém. That was the last confirmed movement either man ever made. Then came the testimony that transformed an already unusual investigation into something even stranger. Several residents later claimed they had seen an intense bright light above the hill around sunset. Descriptions varied. Some called it a glowing orange object. Others remembered a brilliant flash that seemed to hang silently in the sky before disappearing. Police interviewed the witnesses, but none of the accounts could be independently verified. There were no photographs, no official reports, and no physical evidence connecting the strange light to the deaths. Still, the timing was difficult to ignore. Within only a few hours, the two electronics technicians would be found dead on the hillside, and the final people who had seen them alive had unknowingly preserved the last fragments of a journey that would never be fully understood. When Miguel Viana and Manuel Cruz were brought to the medical examiner's office, investigators believed the case had reached its turning point. Witness statements could be mistaken, rumors could spread, but forensic evidence was expected to speak with certainty. Instead, it remained almost completely silent. The first problem was time. By the time the two bodies were discovered, they had been lying on Morro do Vintém for nearly 3 days beneath the Brazilian winter sun. Although temperatures were milder than during the summer months, decomposition had already begun, significantly reducing what forensic specialists could learn from the bodies. The external examination revealed remarkably little. Neither man showed signs of a struggle. There were no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no fractures, and no injuries that could explain such a sudden death. Their clothing was undamaged, their wallets still contained cash, and both wristwatches remained untouched. From every visible indication, nothing had been stolen and no obvious act of violence had taken place. The investigation then turned to toxicology. The handwritten note recovered from Miguel's pocket instructed the men to take the capsules, making laboratory analysis one of the most important steps in the entire case. Tissue samples and internal organs were collected with the hope of identifying poison, medication, or any other chemical substance that might explain their deaths. That answer never came. According to later accounts of the investigation, the material required for a complete toxicological examination deteriorated before reliable testing could be completed. Without usable samples, forensic experts could neither confirm nor rule out poisoning. The capsules became the central mystery of the case, yet science was unable to determine what they had contained or whether they had existed at all. Among the personal belongings recovered from the hillside was another curious object. A neatly folded white handkerchief found inside one of the raincoats. Detectives examined it for stains, chemical traces, and any indication that it had been used during the men's final hours. Nothing unusual was found. Like so many other objects collected from the scene, it raised questions without providing answers. The lead masks themselves were sent to military specialists for technical analysis. Their unusual shape had led some investigators to wonder whether they had been designed to shield the wearers from radiation, or some form of intense light. The results quickly dismissed those ideas. The masks contained nothing extraordinary, only ordinary sheet lead, cut by hand, with no radioactive contamination, no electronic components, and no hidden mechanism. Whatever purpose they served, it was not one the laboratory could identify. Police also searched the men's homes, where they recovered notebooks filled with electrical calculations, sketches, circuit diagrams, and technical notes. Most of the material reflected their long-standing interest in electronics, but several pages contained unusual sequences of numbers and handwritten instructions that investigators could not fully interpret. Whether they were related to an unfinished experiment, a personal code, or something entirely unrelated has never been established. By the end of the first week, detectives had reached an unsettling realization. Every important piece of evidence had now been examined, yet none of it answered the one question that mattered most. The autopsy could not determine the cause of death. Toxicology failed to identify the mysterious capsules. The white handkerchief revealed nothing. The lead masks proved to be ordinary pieces of metal, and the notebooks offered only fragments of a story that no one could fully understand. Rather than forming a coherent picture, the evidence seemed to pull the investigation in different directions. For the first time, detectives were forced to consider a disturbing possibility. The truth behind the lead masks case might never be uncovered through forensic evidence alone. If the physical evidence had reached a dead end, investigators were left with only one remaining lead. It wasn't hidden inside a laboratory report or buried somewhere in the official case files. It was a small handwritten note found inside Miguel José Viana's raincoat pocket. A piece of paper no larger than a folded receipt that, over the following decades, would become one of the most debated documents in Brazilian criminal history. Unlike the lead masks, which immediately captured the public's imagination because of their strange appearance, the note attracted little attention at first. Detectives initially treated it as nothing more than a reminder or a set of personal instructions. But as every other piece of evidence failed to explain why two healthy electronics technicians had climbed an isolated hill only to die side by side without visible injuries, that simple note gradually became the center of the entire investigation. Its importance came from one undeniable fact. Everything written on it appeared to describe events that had already taken place. The journey to Niterói had happened. The meeting had happened. The two men had reached Morro do Ventém exactly as planned. If the first part of the note reflected reality, investigators naturally began asking whether the remaining instructions had also been followed exactly as they were written. The original message was brief, written in Portuguese in Miguel's handwriting. There were no names, no dates, and no explanation of its purpose. Instead, it resembled a checklist, almost as if someone wanted to make sure that every step of an experiment would be completed in the correct order. The first instruction read, 16:30, be at the agreed location. For detectives, that sentence immediately raised an obvious question. Agreed with whom? Throughout the investigation, police interviewed relatives, friends, co-workers, and members of the spiritualist groups both men had attended. Yet no one could identify the person who was supposedly waiting at that location. There was no evidence that Miguel and Manuel had arranged to meet another individual on the hill, and no witness ever reported seeing a third person with them during their final hours. Even more curious was the wording itself. The note did not specify the destination because apparently it did not need to. Whoever wrote those instructions already knew exactly where the meeting would take place. The location required no description, no address, not even the name of Morro do Ventém. It was simply the agreed location, suggesting that both participants had discussed the plan long before the journey began. Witnesses later confirmed that Miguel and Manuel left Campos dos Goitacazes that morning, carrying enough money for travel. Wearing ordinary business clothes, and behaving in a completely relaxed manner. Nothing suggested they expected danger. They did not tell their families they were going on a mysterious mission or conducting a risky experiment. Instead, they explained that they needed to purchase electronic equipment in Niteroi, an explanation that appeared entirely believable given their profession as electronics technicians. That ordinary explanation, however, quickly fell apart once investigators reconstructed the day's timeline. Instead of spending the afternoon shopping for parts, the two men bought raincoats despite clear weather, purchased a bottle of mineral water from a local bar, climbed an isolated hill overlooking the city, and were never seen alive again. Every confirmed event matched the progression of the handwritten note with unsettling precision. The second instruction was even more disturbing. 1830, swallow the capsules. Unlike the first line, which described movement, this sentence described an action. It implied preparation, timing, and expectation. Whatever the capsules contained, Miguel and Manuel clearly intended to take them at a specific hour rather than immediately after arriving. Investigators immediately searched the hillside for bottles, packets, medicine containers, or anything that could have held the mysterious capsules. They found nothing. The men's clothing contained no pharmaceutical packaging. Their pockets revealed no prescription medication. The surrounding vegetation showed no obvious discarded containers, despite extensive searches conducted after the bodies were discovered. The capsules themselves had simply disappeared. That absence became one of the greatest frustrations of the investigation. Had detectives recovered even a single capsule, modern forensic science might have been able to determine its composition. Instead, they were left with nothing but a handwritten reference to an object that no longer existed. Initially, investigators believed toxicological analysis would solve the mystery. If the capsules had contained poison, hallucinogens, sedatives, or another chemical substance, traces should have remained. For investigators, the handwritten note raised a disturbing possibility. What if Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz had not been victims of an attack at all? What if everything that happened on Morro do Vintém had been planned by the two men themselves? To answer that question, police had to look beyond the hillside and into another part of their lives, a world where electronics, science, and spiritual beliefs had become strangely connected. Both men worked as electronics technicians, a profession that required precision and technical knowledge. During the 1960s, Brazil experienced a rapid growth of amateur radio, television repair, and electronic experimentation. Skilled technicians often built their own transmitters, receivers, and measuring devices. Miguel and Manuel belonged to that generation. Friends later recalled that their interest gradually expanded beyond ordinary electronics. They became fascinated by the idea that technology might be used to communicate with forces beyond the physical world. To understand why this did not seem unusual at the time, investigators examined Brazil's cultural environment. Spiritism, based on the teachings of Allan Kardec, had become one of the country's most influential religious movements. Unlike many spiritual traditions, Kardecist Spiritism claimed that spiritual phenomena could be studied scientifically. Its followers believed that communication with spirits followed natural laws that had simply not yet been fully understood. This belief encouraged an unusual combination of science and mysticism. Across Brazil, small groups experimented with electronic devices during spiritual sessions, hoping to capture voices, signals, or other evidence of communication with another dimension. While modern science has found no reliable evidence supporting these experiments, they attracted not only occult enthusiasts, but also engineers, technicians, physicians, and educated professionals. For many participants, electronics represented a tool for exploring questions that conventional science could not yet answer, Witnesses told investigators that Miguel and Manuel had become increasingly interested in these ideas during the months before their deaths. They reportedly discussed spiritual energy, higher frequencies, and attempts to contact non-physical intelligences. Police found no evidence that either man belonged to a dangerous cult or criminal organization. Instead, everything suggested two technically skilled men who sincerely believed they were preparing for an unusual experiment. Investigators also discovered that the pair associated with other people, interested in combining electronics with spiritual practices. Some witnesses described meetings where modified radios and homemade devices were used during attempts to receive messages from spirits. None of these claims could be verified, but they established an important fact. Miguel and Manuel were not acting alone in developing these beliefs. They were part of a wider community where technology and spirituality frequently overlapped. One detail became especially important. Some participants believed that altered states of consciousness could improve communication during these experiments. Relaxation, meditation, or other preparation rituals were sometimes discussed. However, investigators never found reliable evidence that Miguel or Manuel regularly used drugs or dangerous chemicals. That made the mysterious instruction to ingest capsules even more significant. No witness could explain what the capsules contained or why they were necessary. The lead masks also began to appear less random. If the two technicians truly believed they were about to witness an intense physical or spiritual event, the masks may have been intended as homemade protective equipment. Over the years, theories suggested protection from bright light, radiation, or electrical energy. None of these explanations could be proven, but they fit the internal logic of an experiment planned by two men who expected something extraordinary to happen. Despite months of interviews, investigators still faced the same obstacle. They could better understand what Miguel and Manuel believed, but belief alone could not explain how they died. No one witnessed the experiment. The capsules were missing. The toxicology evidence had been lost. The notebooks contained only fragments instead of complete instructions. By this stage, the investigation had reached a frustrating conclusion. The case no longer looked like a conventional crime. It had become a mystery shaped by science, personal conviction, and unanswered questions. Understanding why the two men climbed Morro do Vintém wearing raincoats and lead masks explained their intentions. But it still did not explain what happened after they arrived. Nearly 60 years have passed since Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz climbed Morro do Vintém. During that time, investigators, journalists, and researchers have tried to answer the same question. What really happened on that hillside? Yet despite decades of work, the lead masks case remains officially unsolved. The investigation did not fail because detectives ignored the evidence. It failed because the most important evidence slowly disappeared. Today, forensic science can answer questions that investigators in 1966 would never have imagined. Modern laboratories can identify microscopic traces of poison, reconstruct chemical compounds, and detect substances long after exposure. But in this case, those opportunities were lost. The mysterious capsules were never recovered. The original toxicology samples disappeared. Over the following years, much of the physical evidence and many official investigative records were destroyed or discarded as part of routine archival procedures after the case had gone cold. Without the original evidence, modern forensic science has almost nothing left to examine. The missing capsules remain the greatest obstacle to solving the mystery. If they contained medication, investigators would have identified it. If they contained poison, laboratories might have determined the exact cause of death. if they contained an experimental chemical. That discovery alone could have changed the entire investigation. Instead, the single piece of evidence that may have answered every question vanished before anyone understood its importance. The consequences reached far beyond the investigation itself. The deaths of Miguel and Manuel left families searching for answers that never came. Manuel's widow, Nelly, later spoke publicly about the pain of losing her husband and the endless questions that followed. Miguel's parents and sisters appealed through the Brazilian press, hoping someone would finally reveal the truth. But every new lead ended the same way, with disappointment. Investigators continued to receive tips for years. In January 1969, a woman claimed she knew the identity of the killer, but her story quickly collapsed under questioning. A month later, an inmate named Hamilton Desani confessed to participating in the deaths, only for police to discover that the confession had been fabricated as part of an escape plan. In July, another prisoner, Valdir Soares, identified two alleged suspects, known only as the Spaniard and Spider-Man. Detectives followed the information, but neither lead produced evidence capable of moving the investigation forward. One of the most discussed figures was Alexandre Monteiro Silva Neto, better known as Professor Ramayana, a self-proclaimed expert in parapsychology who was already wanted on several fraud charges. Investigators noticed that his initials, AMS, matched the embroidered initials found on the white handkerchief recovered near the bodies. When he was arrested in April 1973, many believed the mystery was finally about to be solved, but despite years of speculation, he was never formally investigated as a suspect in the lead masks case, and no evidence ever connected him directly to the deaths. As time passed, the mystery grew larger than the evidence itself. Newspapers, television programs, and later the internet introduced increasingly dramatic explanations involving UFOs, secret experiments, paranormal rituals, and hidden conspiracies. These theories captured public imagination because they offered certainty where the investigation could not. Yet none of them produced new evidence. They filled the gaps with speculation rather than facts. Perhaps that is why the lead masks case continues to fascinate people around the world. We know who the victims were. We know where they went. We know what they carried and what they intended to do. But the final moments, the reason they died, and what happened after they followed those handwritten instructions, remain unknown. In the end, the greatest mystery is not the lead masks themselves. It is how two ordinary electronics technicians left behind one of the most enduring unsolved cases in modern history. Unless new evidence somehow emerges after nearly 6 decades, the truth may never be known, and the quiet hill of Morro do Vintem will likely keep its secret forever.